We have a poll here from Gallup, which actually shows belief in 5 supernatural entities edges down to new lows. Well, first, I don't even like that framing, supernatural entities. They're talking about God, angels, heaven. They bleep out, censor out the word hell, and also the devil. Yeah, so belief in God has edged downward. You see the trend over the past 20 years or so. It was interesting because as I was reading this article, one thing that really was depressing to me was the fact that they were listing the discrepancy between Catholics and Protestants and the number of Catholics and Protestants who believe in God. Why would it not be 100% for both groups?
You would think.
It's totally insane, but you can identify
and
as
we talked
Catholic,
about this
right?
a little bit. There is a cultural element to Christianity, especially people who will say, oh, I was raised Protestant, but I actually do nothing about it. I don't read the Bible. I go to church when I'm made to go to church. They don't live it, but they will claim the identity. I think that can be attributed to a little bit of this.
I think it parallels the decline in people that feel patriotic and feel proud of America.
Absolutely.
You look at the trend lines that they parallel.
And fatherlessness too, because there's a reason he is described as God the Father. There are many reasons for it, but a person's relationship with their father is going to inform their attitudes towards God very heavily. In fact, statistically, we know one of the number one predictors of a child choosing to stay with their religion of their family is whether their dad practices that faith. If the mom practices that faith, they're likely to some degree to stay in, but not nearly as likely as if their dad practices the faith. It's incredibly important. Kids learn about God by the way that their fathers act, and it's something that we don't really account for or consider.
God and how to live. I mean,
exactly.
Children learn all sorts of things through their parents, and the decisions that you make in your life and when you become a parent should be cognizant of the fact that someone is now watching you, someone is looking up to you. And I think so much of our anti-responsibility culture parallels this, right? Like, I don't want to think about God because I don't want to think about the afterlife, because I don't want to have to think about the fact that my decisions have consequences.
In 30 years of being on radio, I've invited Jesse Jackson on dozens of times. He won't even respond.
Shocking.
I've invited Al Sharpton on dozens of times, won't respond. Maxine Waters won't respond. Louis Farrakhan wouldn't respond. But one of these so-called black leaders, Kwesi Mfume, at the time he was head of the NAACP, president, he was in Congress in Maryland. Now he's back in Congress in Maryland. And he did come on the show. And my first question was as follows. Mr. Mfume, as between the presence of white racism or the absence of black fathers, which poses a bigger threat to the black community? Without missing a beat, to his credit, he said the absence of black fathers.
Good for him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's undeniable. And you're right, it is to his credit because the entire left-wing establishment is going to punish anyone who says something like that. But it's just so undeniably true.
Yeah. I was just wondering if I could ask, you're listing this band of people who don't want to speak to you, presumably because you're conservative or Republican. Right. Can you tell us a little about how you got to this place politically?
You mean how I became conservative? Or,
when did you adopt the title of Republican?
My mom was a Democrat, my dad was a Republican, and they would have these very interesting disputes across the dinner table. Nobody called anybody a fascist. Nobody called anybody a Nazi. Nobody said you only care about the rich, you don't care about the poor. And so as a kid, you identify with your mom. And so I was a Democrat. In fact, the first person I voted for president was Jimmy Carter. Oh, wow. And that was because he Ford pardoned Nixon. And I thought that was inappropriate. I now think it was a smart thing to do. And so I punished him for doing that. And so I voted for Jimmy Carter. But from that point on, I voted Republican.
You punished the American people if you helped Carter get elected.
I was an independent for years. And then I decided to run against Barbara Boxer. I forget the year, but a bunch of people prevailed upon me to do that. And so I switched my affiliation from independent to Republican. And then I flew to D.C. to interview with a bunch of Republican senators to see if I can get the nomination, get the endorsement during the primary season. If they had endorsed me, I was going to run. Mm-hmm. They endorsed Carly Fiorina instead of me, so I decided not to run. And by the way, when I found out that they endorsed her, I said, why? They said 3 reasons. She's a woman. I said, I'll give you that. I'm not going to have a sex change operation to run for Senate. She has more money than you do. She did because she just resigned from Hewlett Packard. They gave her a big settlement. The third reason was she has higher name recognition than you do. I said, no, she doesn't. Maybe she does in D.C., but not in California. I had a 30% name recognition. Barbara Boxer's first 2 opponents, a guy named Bruce Hershenson and then a guy named Matt Fong at the same juncture, had a 5% name recognition. And Carly Fiorina lost by 10 points and put very little, by the way, of her own money into the campaign. Yeah. Long answer to your question, that's when I became a registered Republican, but I've always been a small L libertarian.
Well, I was going to say, if you were identified as a potential candidate to run for office as a Republican, they must have been aware that you were toying with conservative ideas. Was that something that you got a lot of pushback for? And did you resist? Did you stay an independent to resist the label of Republican?
I think so, because I always felt both parties still spend, and I still do. One of the things I'm proposing is an amendment to the Constitution to fix spending to a certain percentage of the GDP.
That's great.
With exceptions for war and for natural disaster. Other than that, they both spend. And part of it is because the so-called entitlements programs are on automatic pilot. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and a few others. And if you even suggest you're going to reform them and try to run for office, you're going to lose.
Well, so
the can gets kicked down the road. Even Barack Obama and Bill Clinton used the word unsustainable to describe the entitlements program. So everybody knows that they're unsustainable. You just can't politically do anything about it.
You can't be the one to axe them. Yeah.
No. And however, if you are forced to do it by law, then and only then will there be a reform. For young people like you, they're not going to be there. And so it seems to me the president, and I will do that when I become president, will use the bully pulpit to explain this to people, particularly young voters, that this is in your best interest and maybe something can happen.
And so I just want to ask quickly, where would you fix that GDP to revenue ratio?
10%, which is half of what it is at right now.
All right,
which is going to require massive changes.
Yeah.
And I say 10% because in 1900, at all three levels, state, local, and federal, believe it or not, government took 9% from the American people. Now all three levels, government takes 32%. And in my opinion, if you put a cost to the mandates, government takes almost 50%. Yep. This is way bigger than what the founding fathers intended. They did not intend for there to be an income tax. They intended for the limited duties and obligations of the federal government to be paid for by duties and tariffs. They would be appalled at Obamacare. They'd be appalled at Social Security. They'd be appalled at Medicare. They'd be appalled at FEMA. They'd be appalled at the things that the federal government is doing.
Well, it's interesting you point out that the federal government takes so much of our money, and they have, and you're right. There's an interesting observation. This is referred to as Hauser's Law. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but the basic idea is that regardless of where tax rates are, regardless of how much the government tries to take, since World War II, federal revenues have always hovered around 19.5%, which just goes to show that if you impose these insanely high taxes on people, they either become less productive, and so there's less to tax, or they start hiding their money so the government can't get to it.
Right. Rich people are not rich because they're stupid.
Yeah, that's right.
They hide their money or they put them in other kinds of things so that they're taxed less.
Yeah, and so, there are certain left-wing commentators who will scoff at the idea of the Laffer Curve. And a more sophisticated left-wing approach is to say, okay, the Laffer Curve exists, but I don't think the parabola peaks until we're at 70% in terms of our tax rate. All right, well, that's ridiculous, but at least you're acknowledging the reality that if you tax people at 0%, you'll have zero revenue. If you tax them at 100%, you'll also have zero revenue because no one's going to work. And there's some point along the middle where you maximize revenue for the government. But it's also very valuable for us to have this empirical data that shows us you don't seem to be able to get past 20% on the federal level in terms of what you're taking in. So why aren't they adjusting the way they tax us so that we can keep more of our money, since their revenue pretty much won't shift from there?
That's a great point. We were talking earlier about the ignorance between how many unarmed black men are killed versus what people think. Same thing with taxes. I was at a party a few years ago. A buddy of mine was celebrating his birthday. He's a Vietnam vet, so I assumed everybody at the party was conservative, thinking like I think. Yeah. There's a woman, and she started complaining. Tell me about it. It's always somebody. She was complaining about how rich people didn't pay very much in taxes. I thought she was joking at first. She kept saying it over and over again. And I said, excuse me, I overheard you say rich people don't pay their taxes. I said, I'm probably one of the so-called rich if you define somebody making above $350,000 or more as in the top 1%. I said, I have my 1040 in the car. Would you like to see it? She said, no. I said, of all the federal taxes, what percentage do you think is paid by the rich? She said, what do you mean? I said, assume this pie is all the federal taxes. What slice by percentage is paid by the top 1%? She said, oh, I see what you mean. 1%. She said, maybe 2%.
Oh my gosh.
And Seamus, I kept waiting for her to ask me what the answer was. Because she saw my face. I looked appalled like you did. And she never asked. She didn't want to know. And the number is 40%.
Yeah.
While taking in 15 to 20% of the nation's income. So if anything, rich people are overtaxed, not undertaxed.
Well, I think doesn't want to hear that.
No, when you look at income tax, I think it's what the top 10% pays 90% of the income tax.
And
it's insane.
And the bottom 50% pay about 4%. They pay almost nothing.
And then once
and
you
I have
get below
to say, the best part of that story is that you were driving around with your tax.
Oh yeah. Look, I'll show you.
You're like, any minute.
I'm ticked off.
You're listening for these kind of complaints. Like, when can I bring
I'm in California. When you put in the state income tax, sales tax, property taxes, it is not uncommon for somebody with regular income as opposed to capital gains income being taxed at 60%.
Yeah. Well,
Even Bill Maher complained about it one time.
and this is part
when
of
you've
why,
lost Bill Maher, then you're probably overtaxing people.
and as someone who runs a business myself, when you have to cut that money out of your own bank account rather than having your employer withhold it from you, you start seeing taxes in a little bit of a different way.
Right.
This is one of these reforms that I know there are probably implications to this that I'm not really exploring by so haphazardly suggesting we do this, but I'm often tempted to say we should make every American person pay their taxes that way. No one should have their taxes withheld by their employer. You should have to pay it in a lump sum so that you see what they're taking from you.
I heard Milton Friedman say it was a huge mistake that we have automatic withholding like that. Because if people really saw what they were being charged for taxes, we would have changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's true. I think that's one of the problems some of our systems insulate people, or they keep people from the realities of what they do. I this is one of my favorite tangents of all time, but I really think that we need to breed a culture of responsibility and long-term thinking. I think there are reasons why this tax withholding it seems nice and somebody else deals with it, but ultimately you vote very differently when you're well informed. This is a theme we keep coming back to tonight. When you're talking to this woman at a dinner party and she says, I don't want to know, it's because that way she doesn't have to change her opinion. She doesn't have to evolve her worldview based on accurate information.
And being well informed brings us to the disaster that we call public education in the inner city. 13 public high schools, 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. 0. Another half a dozen where 6% can. Another half dozen where 1% can. That's half of all the public high schools in Baltimore, all located in the inner city. The kids are 1% or 0% math proficient.
It's
Chicago,
horrible.
53 schools, 0% are math proficient. If you can't, and 85% of blacks in the 8th grade, these are 13-year-old kids, can neither do math nor read at grade level, and half of them can't do basic reading, which means you cannot critically think.
Yeah.
And you can be manipulated by emotion.
So
it's scary.
It is
terrifying.
scary. I'll mention this. My father was a public school teacher on the south side of Chicago, and for his entire career he taught, and then towards the end of his career he became vice principal and then eventually principal. And one thing he would talk about was the fact that when they, as the high school, would get these students from their middle schools, they were so unbelievably far behind that the best they could hope to get them to do was still significantly below where they should be. It's a very sad state of affairs when you look at how broken that system is.
Teaching to the curve.
Yes.
And as a result, everybody else suffers.
That's
which
right.
is why we got to have vouchers.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.